lie on your back. Oh, what was that? Was that a hand?
I'm just going to say, can you keep the nerd look and bring it down about a centimetre? I think it's some sort of, actual model.
Oh, yeah. Oh, thank God. A regular sound source. Yep, there we go. That's better. So yeah, please lie on your back, have your legs long, have your arms resting alongside yourself. And sense in yourself, where is the place in your body where you experience the firmest contact with the floor? Where is it? Now, if that place is the place of firmest contact, where in yourself is the place of least contact? Now, I don't mean no contact, I mean least, where you really have to start looking around with your attention, going, is it there? Am I contacting the floor there? I'm not sure. So there's already an example of bottom up and top down attention. Because there's days that you're going to lie on the floor and it's going to feel like that pokey bit right there, it's just really annoying. And you're not having to think about it, it's just coming to you. And there's going to be times when I'm going to be asking you to notice very subtle things, and you'll need to direct your attention very subtly to notice it. Roll to one side, come up to sitting. And lean on the floor behind you with your hands. Put the soles of your feet together. And imagine yourself sitting in the center of a clock face with 12 o'clock in front of you and 6 o'clock behind you. Have you positioned your legs in a place that you consider will make it easy to rock your pelvis 12 to 6? Have you? Have you learned from prior experience? Please rock your pelvis 12 to 6 and find out. I mean, we've had a whole lunchtime. Things might have changed. I say that half jokingly, but half seriously. Things change day to day. So the position of your legs before, well, that was good for before. Will it be good for now? You won't know until you move. So please let yourself adjust the position of your legs as circumstances change. That's what's important. Because that's what's happening in the world all the time. The world and your body are continuously changing. Stop moving your pelvis. Move your head 12, 6, 12, 6. As you move your head 12, 6, do you feel any involvement of the pelvis? Is that something that you've incorporated into the pattern, or is that something that is yet to be established? Let that be. Lie on your back. Place your hands on your abdomen at around navel level, belly button level. And as you breathe in and as you breathe out, notice any movement that you sense happening there. Please bend your legs, stand your feet. And continue to pay attention to the movements of the abdomen as you breathe in and as you breathe out. Now, the next time that you go to breathe in, could you intentionally swell, expand the abdomen just a few times? And please don't breathe in more than you can. Notice what happens with your chest when you expand the abdomen to breathe in. Now, let yourself just breathe naturally, however you tend to breathe, just breathe. And shift your hands to your chest. And as you go to breathe in, could you intentionally expand the chest? It's like you're filling the chest full of air. Don't force yourself. Just expand the chest enough intentionally so that you know it's the chest expanding and not the belly, not the tummy, not the abdomen. Okay, now stop for a moment and listen carefully to the next intention. At a moment when you're ready, you're just simply going to stop breathing. And at the moment you stop breathing, you're going to intentionally expand your abdomen and then intentionally draw your abdomen in and then expand your chest. And then expand the abdomen, expand the chest, all while you're not breathing. Now, don't hold your breath too long, but just a few movements. So go ahead and do that in your own time. many times. At a moment that you feel ready, stop breathing. There's no need to tighten your throat. And when you stop breathing, intentionally swell the abdomen and then draw the abdomen in and swell the chest and go back and forth, pushing the abdomen out, drawing it in, expanding the chest, back and forth, back and forth. And you should breathe before you turn blue. So what you're doing here is you're intentionally mobilizing those parts of yourself that could be involved in breathing. But notice they're not involved in breathing because you're holding your breath. You're stopped breathing, which tells you something very important. You can disassociate the movements of breathing from these movements. Now, change the intention just slightly. Keep doing these movements, expanding the belly, drawing the belly in, expanding the chest, and see if it's possible to breathe while you do it. And when I say to breathe while you do it, I mean for the breathing to be totally independent of those movements. That over the duration of one in-breath, you could do several of those movements, and those movements not interfere with the in-breath. And over the duration of an out-breath, you could do several of those movements, and it not to interfere with the flow of the out-breath. Just play with that for a few moments in your own time. Okay, please stop. Let that be. Roll on up to sitting. Sit with your feet together, knees apart, leaning on the floor behind you with your hands. And do the movements that you were just doing lying on the floor, but now upright. Think of swelling the abdomen out, down, fully, and then draw the abdomen in, swell the chest, expand the chest, and all the while you can just be breathing. And the only constraint in this whole thing is that you remain leaning on your hands. That you remain leaning on the floor with your hands. Now keep on doing what you're doing. Expanding the belly, drawing the belly in, expanding the chest, and start to move your pelvis 12 to 6. As your pelvis goes to 6, notice if there's a particular affinity for either drawing in the abdomen or pushing the abdomen out. Which one is it? When you take the pelvis towards 12, When you take the pelvis towards 6 behind you, is there an affinity for drawing that belly in or expanding the abdomen out? And by affinity, I just simply mean those two things seem like they go well together. Now, change one little element. Instead of leaning on your hands behind you, could you place the palms of your hands on your knees and continue? And notice, what kind of difference does that make? The soles of the feet are together, unless that's really uncomfortable, which then you please feel free to change the position of your legs to something that is more acceptable. What difference does it make when you're not leaning on your hands on the floor behind you anymore? And if you're not sure, you can just take the hands, put them back behind you, and notice what's different. And now intentionally put your hands on the floor behind you, lean on the floor, and continue. And pay attention to the chest. When does it make sense to expand the chest? Moving your pelvis towards 12 or moving your pelvis towards 6? Ah. Are you sure that your hands are behind you? Or are they to the side of you? They're two different positions. Behind you. Where is behind? Stop and rest, please. Now, remember that question I asked right at the beginning? Which parts of you most firmly rest into the floor? Has anything changed? Now, as you're lying on your back, could you bring the soles of your feet together and have your knees apart? And please do make sure that the soles are touching, the pads of the toes are touching. In other words, you have complete contact between the feet. The outside edges of your feet will be resting on the floor. Now, this next intention is entirely in your imagination. Imagine yourself drawing both of your feet closer to your pelvis, the underneath surface of your pelvis. That's the pelvis that you sit on, the sitting bones. Just imagine that. As you imagine that, imagine your knees bending more, your hip joints bending more. Sorry? Yes, your feet are sliding on the floor in your imagination, bringing your heels closer and closer to your buttocks, but you remain, lying on the floor. Now, please begin to do just a little bit what you were imagining. And then return just a little bit. Think of bringing your feet a little bit closer to your buttocks and then return. Yep. No. Can you bend the legs? Same thing. Just think that your feet are there, and now try to bring your feet towards your buttocks. Yeah, that's it. That's the same. Okay. Notice what happens with your pelvis as you try to draw your feet towards your buttocks. So if you use that device of a clock, if you imagine your pelvis lying in the center of the clock, and 12 o'clock is towards your feet, and 6 o'clock is towards your head, what happens with your pelvis as the feet start to be drawn towards it? Does the pelvis get moved? Now, if you're contracting your abdominal muscles enthusiastically, can I say it like that? Then of course the pelvis isn't going to get moved anywhere. But if you didn't, if you were just simply lying there quietly and you thought, I think I'll just bring my feet a little closer to myself, and did nothing special with the back muscles, with the abdominal muscles, nothing, would your pelvis get moved through the motion of your legs? Given that there's a little bit of friction on the floor, would you agree? Can you feel that? Okay, please let that be. Now, I know for some of you, lying with the soles of your feet together and your knees wide apart is not a position that you would choose for comfort. So here's my suggestion. If that's not possible, please don't let your knees flop outwards as far as possible. In other words, don't just let the legs hang off all the connective tissue or off the ligaments. Keep your knees at a height from the floor that is comfortable for you, and that will work a lot better. And if it's still, for some of you, uncomfortable in the area of the groin, well, just stand the feet on the floor. That's fine. But have the same idea of drawing your feet towards your buttocks. It'll work. Please roll to one side, come up to sit. Sit with the soles of your feet together, lean on the floor behind you with your hands. And start to do that which you did lying on your back a few moments ago. Think of drawing your feet towards the front of your pelvis. And then sending your feet away, drawing them in, sending them away. And if you do have trouble with your hip joints, you can do this with your feet standing on the floor. It's fine. Or you could have the knees slightly more lifted. That's fine too. And notice what happens with your pelvis. If you're sitting on a clock, and you're doing this movement with your legs, does your pelvis start rocking 12 and 6, 12 and 6? That's it. Cramps in any position? Do a little less. Do a little less. You could get something and put them underneath here. Yeah. And if I just keep your feet like that, just think of bringing your feet a little bit towards your pelvis, a little bit. That's enough. And now push them away. That's enough. That's it. Your pelvis is moving. Can you feel that? That's all that's needed. Please let that be. Pause for a little bit. So you've just done two different variations, two different intentions. Doing all that business, expanding the belly, expanding the chest, and some of you felt really clearly how that moved your pelvis. And then you've just done this business of pulling the legs and pushing the legs, and some of you once again felt how that moved your pelvis. So based on those experiences, you start to realize, oh, there's a lot more involved in moving my pelvis than I thought. I can use many more things to move the pelvis. That it's not just the pelvis. Because the pelvis is a bone and it can't do anything really. So where you put the work can be a little bit distributed all over. Does that, yeah? Come up to sitting. Lean on the floor behind you with your hands. Have the soles of your feet together and begin to rock your pelvis 12 and 6, 12 and 6. And start to compose for yourself a way of rocking your pelvis that just doesn't simply involve the muscles of the back, but somehow involves the legs and the movements of the abdomen and the movements of the chest and the movements of the head. So that rolling the pelvis, rocking the pelvis 12 to 6 becomes an all over event. That's it. Now, without even wanting to be conceptual, you see, this is your whole system at work. All the parts related around a particular intention. And your experience that emerges out of that mutual cooperation through everywhere could be quite different to the experience that you began with this morning. Right. Leave that alone. Rest. Please bend your legs, put the soles of your feet together. Now, as I said, if that is a position that for the moment is not available to you because of hip joint pain or pelvic pain or lower back pain, then please stand your feet on the floor, and that will be just as good. Start to rock your pelvis 12 to 6, 12 being towards your feet, 6 being towards your head. And as you do that, track the movement of your tailbone. As you rock your pelvis towards 12 o'clock in the direction of your feet, your tailbone will come closer to the floor. As you rock your pelvis towards 6 in the direction of your head, your tailbone will get higher from the floor. And you're free to use your legs except in one way. Don't push the feet into the floor. You can use your legs however other way you like, but don't try to use the floor as leverage to push against to move your pelvis. Don't do that. Now, please continue, but put your left foot on top of your right. And if you have both feet standing, just stand the heels on the toes of the other foot. There we go. And continue. Rock your pelvis so that you definitely know in your sensation that the tailbone is lifting and lowering as you're going 12 to 6 and 12 to 6. And this is an asymmetrical position of the legs, but it's also kind of like a little trick to make sure that you're not using your left leg to push the floor with. Because you can sense whether you're pushing it onto your foot, can't you? Your other foot will tell you, hey, stop pushing into me. What do you think I am, a platform of some kind? Switch the feet over. And now return both feet to the floor, soles of the feet touching. Keep doing what you're doing, not pressing the floor deliberately with the feet. And as you start to rock the pelvis more and more frequently, notice if you sense anything happening on the back of your chest relative to the floor. Can you sense any motion of the back of your chest relative to the floor? And is that motion in some way related to what you're doing with your pelvis? Is there some sort of pattern that you can detect? And now the same thing with the head. As you rock your pelvis 12 to 6, and if you direct your attention up there on your head, where the back of your head rests on the floor, can you detect movement there? Is your head being moved through the motion of your pelvis, legs, spine? And more than that, is there some correlation? Is there some relationship between what you're doing with your pelvis and the head? When you roll your pelvis to 6, where does your chin go relative to your throat? When you roll your pelvis to 12, where does your chin go relative to your throat? Let that be. Pause for a little while. It's moments like these when contact with the floor can be a very useful device for sensing what's going on in terms of movement relationships in your body. Please roll to one side, come up to sitting. Sit once more with the soles of the feet together, leaning on your hands behind you. And now this time, could you direct your face and your eyes directly in front of you, as if you're looking at something straight ahead of you? And keep your face oriented to that place. Don't let it change. Don't let it tilt up or down. Keep it constant. Your head might bob up and down, but that's fine. And start to rock your pelvis, 12 and 6. So you do nothing to change the inclination of your head. Nothing. And this is quite a contrast to what you just experienced lying on the floor, where you were rolling your pelvis and you suddenly detected, oh yeah, my head gets moved by my pelvis. And up here, you're now going for the opposite effect. My head could be kind of still in space, and yet everything could move underneath. Both are possible. If you carefully look at the wall or whatever you're looking at in front of you, you might notice that as you rock your pelvis in one direction, your gaze gets a bit higher, not because your head's inclining, but because your head is rising relative to the height of the room. And that would be using visual feedback, not to tell you about the room, but to tell you about yourself. That somehow, in the process of rolling your pelvis, your spine changes shape and your head gets lifted higher. And then your spine changes shape and your head gets lowered lower. And you'd be able to see this so much more clearly if you had a big Cobra hat with a nice brim on it at the front, where you've got some visual feedback, and you'd see the room changing up and down relative to the front of the Cobra hat. Try it. Okay, let that be. Pause again. So for those of you that don't know, in a former life, I was a professional dancer. And at one stage in my life, I got to dance in my most favorite ever musical, Fiddler on the Roof. And in that musical, of course, you wear those, those nice Jewish hats with the very broad rims around here. I got to do the bottle dance. But that business about the Akubra hat, that's when I first found that out. As soon as I put that hat on and I saw a level, my ability to do pirouettes, my average was about 3. I could do 3 really good pirouettes, but with that hat on, I could do 5. Because suddenly I had a sense of where my head was in the room in a way that I never, ever, ever had before from visual feedback. It's like, whoa. Now, nothing changed in my skill, right? Skill set was the same, but the feedback was different. So sometimes really getting a sense of what you're doing immediately approves what it is and how you do it. A little bit afterwards, yes. And then it'll kind of go again. So yeah, I went back to the hat many times. So it was a nice 6-month season, which was great. Yeah, and then it got better. Yeah. So, there's all sorts of ways of getting feedback like that from each other, from the verbal feedback of somebody, from watching. Watching in the mirror is tricky. Videos of yourself, the ground, water, all sorts of ways of getting feedback. Please lie on your back. Have the soles of your feet together. Now, we haven't talked about the rest of the clock. So let's go to the rest of the clock a little bit. So if 12 o'clock is towards your feet and 6 o'clock is towards your head, where would 3 o'clock be? And then where would 9 o'clock be? So could you please intentionally move yourself so that your right thigh comes closer to the floor? But don't do any intentional movements with your legs. So the legs stay quiet, but you move the rest of yourself so that the right thigh comes closer to the floor. And when you bring the right thigh closer to the floor, towards which hour are you rolling your pelvis? And if you were to continue elaborating the self-image in terms of what's happening, as that right thigh comes closer to the floor, which side of your lower back lifts further from the floor? Which side of your lower back gets more arched? Onto which side of your chest do you end up leaning a little bit more? And now do the opposite. Start to mobilize yourself in such a way that you experience your left thigh coming closer to the floor. And then return. And to which hour are you rolling your pelvis when you do that movement? And now continue to do that movement and notice something. In your own internal appreciation, if you measure the distance from your armpit to your right hip, and then if you measure the distance from your left armpit to your left hip, which of those distances shortens as you take your left thigh towards the floor? In other words, does your right side get shorter or does your left side get shorter the more you bring your left thigh towards the floor? And now would you please alternate? Right thigh towards the floor, return to the middle of the clock. Left thigh towards the floor, return to the middle of the clock. That's it. And one more variation before a little rest. Could you intentionally now use your hands as you lower your right thigh towards the floor? Think that you want to slide your left hand underneath the left hand side of your lower back. So right thigh goes towards the floor. Slide that left hand in underneath the left hand side of your lower back. And then remove it as you bring the pelvis to the middle of the clock. And then as you lower the other thigh, slide the right hand underneath the right hand side of the lower back. And this happens as the thigh is going downwards. As the thigh goes down, you slip in the hand on the opposite side, and you take it out, and then you slip in the hand on the opposite side, and you take it out. And notice whether that helps you to bring the thigh even closer to the floor. Good, that's enough. Stop, pause for a while. What's changed with your contact with the floor? Are there other parts of you that are more prominently touching the floor than before? Roll to one side, come up to sitting. Okay. Sit with the soles of your feet together. Lean on the floor behind you with your hands. Establish your pelvis in the middle of the clock. 12 is in front, 6 is behind. 3 o'clock is which way? Yeah, good. They say the right. What do you say? That's okay. We'll play that little game later on, because depending on how you could be sitting on the top of the clock face, you could be like on the reverse side of the clock face, and the hours change. So that's fine. You keep it where you want it to be. Rock your pelvis intentionally 3 o'clock, middle of the clock, 9 o'clock, middle of the clock. 2 constraints. You see, we're getting more and more specific. 2 constraints. Stay leaning on your hands. Do not take your hands off the floor. Lean on them. And 2, stay with the outside edges of your feet on the floor. Yes, you might. Because if you're trying to work a little bit everywhere, do you think you might be able to use your arm? Yeah. So why not use your arm? First constraint, leaning. Second constraint, that the edges of the feet stay on the floor. So you don't do yeah. Okay. That's probably the most direct way of saying what not to do. Okay. Now, here is where your memory can serve you well. A moment ago, when you were lying on the floor and I asked you to introduce that hand underneath your back, and you asked your back to get your hand under there, do you remember what that feeling was like? Do you remember that feeling of arching your back on one side? Might that help here? So if you're looking for places where to generate power, yes, you can push with one arm, and what will happen is your rib cage will move away from the arm that you're using to push with. Can you feel that? The ribs kind of move away from the elbow. But then you have a lot more to work with. You've got the 2 sides of the muscles on either side of the spine. And if you just use one side, your spine bends sideways. And what's interesting is I didn't mention once to lower the thigh towards the floor, and yet I see people's thighs starting to go towards the floor. So you can even use your thinking, your imagination to go, I'll think of taking my thigh towards the floor, which for some of you is far clearer in your self-image than this crazy idea of a clock underneath your butt. Sorry for the language, but it's true. Some of you are so much more clear about where the thigh is that you're able to direct yourself more crisply, more clearly in that fashion. So use it. Now, when your right thigh is going towards the floor, which shoulder is going forwards? Could you think of the left shoulder going forwards as you take your right thigh towards the floor? Left shoulder forwards, which means the right shoulder will be going backwards. And then as you take your left thigh towards the floor, take the right shoulder forwards and the left shoulder backwards. That's it. I'm not sure whether they have them anymore, but you know at those circus carnivals, they have those clowns with their mouths open that are going, yeah, you put the little ball in. Some of you are starting to look like that. But that's good. That's good. Because there's something about that movement of your shoulders that goes with that particular turning of the head. And it could be that for some of you, as soon as you find that particular way of using your head, the rest of the movement feels like silk. It feels like no work. All the work goes out of it. And that's the thing that we'll never know for a person. What is the element that when you introduce it, the person goes, oh my God, why didn't we do that straight from the start? That just makes sense. Yeah. So in awareness through movement, I can't touch each of you, but I can keep on making suggestions until you go, that's what brings it all together. That's the moment. That's what I needed to feel. That's what I needed to experience. Okay, please stop, rest. Now, you know, for some of you, when you graduate and you want to work with children, you might tempt the child with something of great interest, a toy, a food, whatever, in order to bring the child's head into a very particular relationship to their body, which then can send them into a whole area of movement that they would not have naturally gone to because of some problem that they're having. And in an infant's life, you know, the world pretty much is eyes and mouth. As adults, we're far more complex. So while you're lying there reflecting for a moment, remember some of the movements that we did this morning, moving the pelvis 12 to 6, and recall some of the movements that you've just done now. Because in cognitive science, what they have found is that if you can recall a memory, which, by the way, isn't a recall, it's a recreation. If you can recreate a memory, all the circuits associated with that memory begin to fire, which means your whole muscular system starts to be primed to do the movement that you're recreating. Nice. Please come up to sit. Put the soles of your feet together. Put the hands on the floor behind you. Roll your pelvis 12 to 6 and feel how that's going. And this is where you can recall, recreate, remember. It's interesting, that word remembering, putting back together. Member, remember. Yeah? You remember. Yes, something about movement of the head, something about the movement of the legs, something about the abdomen. Yeah, there was something, I remember that experience, pushing out the abdomen. You start to collect them up and you put them back into this context. All right, that's enough. Leave that, come up to stand. Feel what it's like to stand. But more importantly, walk a little bit. Feel what it's like to walk, having moved your pelvis and coordinated those different parts of yourself to move your pelvis. Notice if walking is a different kind of an experience now. Please have a 10-minute break. We'll come back in 10.